our brains develop sequentially from conception all the way through our developmental period, which can last up through our 20s. And when we're first born, we just have the kinds of functions that we really actually need first, things like sleep-wake state regulation, breathing, sucking and swallowing, attaching to a protective adult. Those kinds of things are more fully developed, and they involve the brainstem and the limbic region of the brain, which is the part of the brain that is responsible for our fight-flight response to danger. And then through our childhoods, different regions of the brain have sensitive developmental periods when they're adapting to experience and delivering to us just the right kinds of skills and abilities that we might need for the next phase of our lives. So the brain is developing all the way up through the frontal cortex, which we use for our thinking processes, and then all of the neural networks are connecting and making these elegant systems of connection among all of the brain regions and brain systems. So from that we know that experience causes adaptation. It causes changes in the mass of brain regions and also the functioning of brain regions, and allows us to have this really elegant match between who we become biologically and the kind of environment that our bodies think we're going to be living in throughout our lives, which our bodies predict that based on our childhood experience. And then in the second letter of NEAR is the E, epigenetics, and I will talk a little bit about that in the course of this set of slides. But it's a whole new field in genetics that's discovered how experience affects gene expression and the ability of our cells to actually read the code that is in our genetic makeup. And so we used to think that our genes were determining who we would become in many ways, including hair color, eye color, etc., but also personality and risk for disease and all those kinds of things. But now scientists understand that experience is also shaping the way our genetic code is interpreted by our cells and making changes to that interpretation. And both of those bodies of science are about studying individuals. And when we talk about the adverse childhood experience study, we're talking about a study of the population as a whole. And that's quite different. It's from the field of epidemiology, and the two co-principal investigators of the adverse childhood experience study, Dr. Vincent Felitti and Dr. Robert Anda, both are physicians, and they were working in very different arenas when they met each other and decided to develop the Adverse Childhood Experience, or ACE study. So the ACE study is a partnership between Kaiser Permanente in San Diego, where Vince Felitti was working as Director of Preventive Medicine, and Dr. Robert Anda of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, who was working as a senior scientist there at the CDC at the time. And both of them noticed that, for various different reasons, that the risk for health challenges was not randomly distributed in the population. So they said, you know, something has to be driving that risk, and we want to understand what it is, because whatever's driving risk for disease and disability and difficulties in life, that could be preventable. And so the more we can discover about the chain of relationships between risk and resilience, the better we can build that chain. And so they developed the Adverse Childhood Experience Study hypothesis was that adversity during childhood was shaping the development of human beings, which was leading to risk, which then in turn led to disease and disability and early death. And they tested that hypothesis with a study of 17,400 plus individuals who were members of the Kaiser Permanente plan in San Diego. And so it is the largest epidemiological study of its kind, huge study, and the findings are stunning. So they considered 10 different kinds of adversity that happen within a household and people's lives as they're growing up. They considered 3 kinds of abuse: sexual abuse, physical abuse, and emotional abuse. They considered 2 kinds of neglect: physical abuse and excuse me, physical neglect and emotional neglect. And they considered 5 kinds of household dysfunction that are proxy for the amount of chaos and fear-producing environments, stressful environments for children as they're growing up. So those are having an incarcerated parent or someone in the household who's been incarcerated, witnessing domestic violence or violence against one's mother, having a drug-addicted or alcoholic family member, having a family member who's mentally ill, suicidal, or severely depressed, and having parents who are divorced or separated. And divorce or separation was considered to be proxy for the kind of stressful environments that happen, that children are exposed to as parents are deciding to become divorced or separated. So that was the reason for that one. And these were never anticipated to be the only 10 kinds of experiences that create adaptation, but rather they occur in an environment that we all know and can understand, and we could create some boundaries around the study so it didn't become such a huge list of things to look at, because they're all contained within household dynamics. And secondly, all of those 10 kinds of adversities are adversities where there was a body of literature on prevention. So they very intentionally built a study where we could understand more about preventing those kinds of stressors in children's lives. And prior to the ACE study, almost all of the literature studied each of those kinds of experiences separately. So scientists looked at physical abuse, and there's a whole body of literature about it, and they looked at it separately, a whole separate body of literature on sexual abuse, for example. We could go through all 10 of those and there would be literatures on them, but no one prior to the ACE study that I'm aware of was looking at the accumulation of many different kinds of stressors in children's lives as they're developing. So when the ACE study data came into the hands of these 2 doctors, the study data taught them tremendous amounts about how stress is shaping development throughout the life course. So some of the big findings from the study are ACEs are very common. They're common across all socioeconomic lines. They're common in all race ethnicity groups. And ACEs have a powerful dose-response relationship to mental, physical, and behavioral health and social problems throughout the lifespan. Those different adverse childhood experience categories are interrelated. They often come in clusters. In fact, out of everyone that had an ACE score of 1 in the original Kaiser Permanente study, 87% had an ACE score of more than 1. So we know that ACEs rarely come in singles. They usually come in clusters. And because of that, the scientists decided it doesn't make any sense to study these problems one at a time like the literature had treated them in the past, but it makes sense to study the accumulation of different kinds of stressors in children's lives as they're growing up. So they created an ACE score, so you could have 0 of those 10 kinds of experiences, in which case your ACE score would be 0, or you could have all 10, in which case your ACE score would be 10. So regardless of the frequency or duration or intensity of physical abuse, for example, if you experience physical abuse, you would get an ACE score of 1 for physical abuse. If you experience physical abuse plus witnessing violence against one's mom, that would be 2, an ACE score of 2, and so forth and so on. So they did look at frequency and intensity, but they found that the highly predictive value was in the number of different categories of adverse childhood experiences that the population had experienced. So the higher the number of categories, or the higher the ACE score, the higher the odds in the population, or the risk in the population, that people will have mental, physical, behavioral, and social challenges throughout the life course. So that's a really quick summary of what we find from the ACE study. We can show me questions along the way. I'm happy to answer them. And the focus here is really about the magnitude of the solution that the ACE study and the cluster of neuroscience presents us, as we're working to really dramatically improve the population's health in our generation. And that's really my main goal in doing this work. Is I'm kind of impatient. I like to work on big changes in population health, and the ACE study and its related science really provides us with that opportunity. So let's see, I should be able to advance slides, and for some reason I'm not able to. So
Laura, you might try.
Do you think I should reset?
Yeah, I would click the unshare your screen, and then reshare your screen and see if that allows you to advance them.
Okay. Screen. No, I don't want that. So where am I going to say?
Let's see.
Can I just change?
There'll be a button that says show my screen.
Click to stop screen sharing.
Yep, there you go.
And then click to share screen. Let's see if that works.
Let's see if that works. Now.
Wow. Okay, let's see. There it is.
Yay!
Yay!
All right.
So whenever I talk about adverse childhood experience, audiences always insist that I talk about resilience. And that's awesome. I know the resilience literature quite well, and I'm happy to do that. I'm going to do that today. But as I start to do that, I want to just remind people that when we focus on resilience, we might be setting our bar for our goals a little too low, because resilience means doing well in the face of great adversity, being strong in the face of great difficulty in life. Yet what we probably want to try to achieve is less adversity, less difficulty in life, less trauma. And so I like to start to think and help people start to think about the option of focusing on flourishing. And flourishing means to prosper with sustained and continuous and steady and strong growing into well. It has this suggestion that we can take a journey orientation, and we can all be growing into well every day of our lives, and we can also make a powerful difference in helping one generation support the conditions for the next, so that every generation can grow into well. So as I'm talking, I want you to kind of in the back of your mind imagine that we're going to move beyond resilience. We'll learn from the resilience literature, but we want to make sure that we're handing this journey to the population that's about growing into well. So I talked a little bit about how neuroscientists have helped us understand more about how the memory of our experience is actually embedded in the biology of our bodies. It's embedded in our brain development, but also in the cellular makeup and our ability to read genetic material in our bodies. And so that experiential memory is not determined through our thought processes so much as is determined through our actual biological adaptations to stress. And that is a common misunderstanding about the difficulties that people can face if they've had a lot of toxic stress in their lives. It's common for the general population to say, why doesn't that person just make a different choice, when it could be that it's not so much a matter of choice, it's about a biological response to stress. And so people will need to make adaptations and have accommodations and have different kinds of supports in their lives if they've experienced a lot of toxic stress during development. We can see that total dose of toxic stress through an ACE score. The ACE score is proxy for the total dose of toxic stress during development. So that's my very brief overview of neuroscience, and now I want to just introduce you to this brand new field of epigenetics. So years ago, when scientists were trying to crack the genetic code, we thought that once we understood the genetic code, we would understand pretty much everything we needed to know to be predicting the course of people's lives and to be understanding what created risk from a genetic perspective. But along the way, a whole new field in genetics was developed, and it's called epigenetics. And epi means on top of, and genetics means origin. So epigenetics is the chemical interaction that essentially lays on top of the genetic code that's in our chromosomes. Our DNA is our genetic code, and they are our genetic code is organized in our chromosomes that are tightly packed into bundles, and those bundles have chemical codes on them called histones that actually help the cells to read or interpret the genetic code that's there, the DNA that's there. And there are a couple of different chemical processes that allow that to happen. I'm not going to go into those today. But what's remarkable about it is that experience actually provides these chemical tags on our DNA that allow our cells either to read the DNA, it can actually amplify the ability of the cell to read the DNA, or it can silence the DNA and keep the cell from being able to read it. And it can also shift the way that DNA is interpreted by a cell. So there are three different ways that epigenetics, that experience, can affect genetic expression. So one of the ways that I like to explain this is through a study that was done by scientists, and they were testing these epigenetic theories, and they raised white rats, the standard lab rats, and they used behavior modification to make those lab rats terrified of cherry blossoms. And when they would place cherry blossoms into the lab rat environment, those lab rats would run to the corner of the environment, climb on top of each other, and create a solid mound of lab rat and shake in terror of the cherry blossoms. So once that had been accomplished, they removed the cherry blossoms from the rat's environment and never reintroduced them again. Those lab rats had rat pups. Those rat pups grew up and became adults, and they were never exposed to cherry blossoms in utero or in their life course. And they took those pups and put them in a different environment entirely, so there was no communication with their parent rats, and introduced cherry blossoms into the environment of the rat pups, now adults. And what do you think those rat pups, now adults, did? They ran to the corner of their environment, they climbed on top of each other to make a solid mound of lab rat, and they shook in terror of cherry blossoms. So I like to think about this in terms of why would it make sense for those rats to be afraid of cherry blossoms, even though nobody went to a blackboard and said you should be afraid of cherry blossoms. There was no direct instruction, no direct communication. They had no cognitive or intellectual reason for being afraid of cherry blossoms. Instead, the message of fear and anxiety associated with cherry blossoms was transmitted through epigenetics from one generation to the next. So why might it be valuable to folks to have anxiety or fear or caution transmitted from one generation to the next without direct instruction? Any of you?
So we can hear you,
I don't know
Laura.
if you're answering because I can't see your chat box. But
I'll
just go ahead.
Can you hear me?
It's because that's how we survive. Oh, there you go. Yes, I can.
Oh, so there's been a little bit of a delay. Did
people have a theory about it in their chat boxes?
No one has answered anything in the question box. If anyone, so when Laura answers a question, if you'd like to raise a hand, you can. We seem to have a little bit of a delay.
Okay.
Not sure why.
Okay, that's great. So the reason is that survival, because if one generation can pass a message about you should have anxiety or fear, you should avoid cherry blossoms, that is very handy if cherry blossoms are in fact poisonous. It means that that next generation doesn't have to have anyone die from the poisonous material. They will instinctively, so to speak, avoid the cherry blossoms. So our bodies have this elegant ability. Let's see, I'm going to ignore that. Our bodies have this elegant ability to adapt and respond not only through our direct brain development processes in childhood, but also by passing information from one generation to the next through epigenetic means. And this is really important for us to understand why historic trauma might have such a powerful impact on a population group, because fear and anxiety can be transmitted across the generations based on the experience of a prior generation. And so a family member might not need to have a direct experience of adversity in order to have the feeling or response to stress that is more extreme than someone maybe from a population that does not have a history of historic trauma. What's amazing to me is that these epigeneticists now understand and are asserting agreement that fear, anxiety, depression, those kinds of emotional responses to stress can be transmitted epigenetically, but now they're beginning to do the studies about whether nurturing behaviors can also be transmitted epigenetically. And their theory is that probably they can. And so one of the foundations of resilience that we want to build is to help one generation develop the kinds of behaviors and patterns that maybe don't come as naturally to them because of their epigenetic history and their people, but if they shift those kinds of nurturing behaviors, epigenetics, in one generation, epigenetics is suggesting that it may provide an ease in the next generation to allow that next generation to find parenting to be more easy, to have less anxiety about those kinds of environments, and to be more effective with nurturing behavior. So epigenetics, a brand new field, new literature coming out every day, every week, every month. We'll learn more over time, and that's one of the most exciting things about this work, is to be in a learning mode. Okay, now something has happened again, so I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to start sharing, and then I'm going to see, still have this problem. It's always the technology that gets you, right? I still don't see slide advancing. So maybe I'll just leave it off for 1 second here, let it readjust itself, and then I'll turn it back on. Okay, let's try that. Any other tricks you can think of?
You know, the one it might be to try advancing the slide while you have it turned off. Like, stop sharing your screen and then try advancing your slide.
Okay. Oh, okay. Yeah.
There you go. Okay.
Yeah. So most of the resilience literature is really about what happens in real life, our experiences with one another, our experiences with our own biology, and our experiences in community. But I want to also say that our neuroscience and our epigeneticists suggest that we should really think in terms of getting a right fit between the kinds of supports we're giving to people and how they have adapted biologically and epigenetically, so that we get a right fit between our expectations of people and what they can realistically handle in terms of stressors and relationship quality, etc. So part of the resilience field that is developing is to figure out what's that right fit between who people have adapted, how people have adapted biologically and genetically, and their experience in community. And I think that part of what we need to think about there is that every person, regardless of how they've adapted to the stressors in their childhood or historically, every single person has some core gifts that they can offer to other people and to the community as a whole. So part of what we need to do is help people surface those core gifts and create space in our social environments for people to give those to others. Let's see now if I can. Yeah. And The resilience literature has really been through several waves. Early on in the resilience literature, we really were learning more descriptive kinds of findings. They would take a population and they would say, here's a population of people, all of whom have experienced some difficulty, and some of them are doing well in their lives, and so what are the differences between these two groups? And they would provide descriptors, and from that early part of resilience literature, we learned things like people with a higher IQ are more likely to do well in spite of great amounts of adversity or stress in their lives, etc. And then we moved into a period of time where we were really looking more at the dynamics or the journey or the unfolding of life and understanding more about how the sequencing and the experience of life might be affecting the accumulation of negatives and positives and creating better outcomes even in the face of adversity at some point in one's life. And now we're in a point where resilience literature is really starting to take a more integrative and more holistic view of how the accumulation of adversity is affecting development, the neuroscience, the epigenetics of that, and also how positive experience, how nurturing experience, for example, is affecting us neurobiologically and epigenetically. But that portion of the resilience literature is really new, and we don't see as many articles about that. And so in my state, in Washington State, we've started systematically adding questions to the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System survey, which is the telephone survey of adults that happens in every state. It's a partnership between the CDC and the State Department of Health. And states have a core set of questions that the CDC puts into the survey. States can add questions to that survey in order to learn extra information. So in Washington, we've used that random sampling survey of adults in the state to really be in a learning mode about resilience. First, we added the ACE questions so we could learn about ACE prevalence among adults, and you've done that also in your state. Then we added questions about adult adversities, including the household functioning kinds of ACEs, so we could calculate what happens throughout the life course when people have adversity in childhood plus adversity in adulthood, and there is a compounding effect that occurs. And then and we can also calculate the rate of intergenerational transmission of ACEs because we added those household functioning ACEs. We then started systematically adding questions from the resilience literature so that we could understand more about how these resilience factors that are written about in the literature, how effective are they in helping moderate ACE effects among people who have very high ACE scores. And that is a new part of resilience literature. We haven't had as much resilience literature that looks at what are the resilience factors that are particularly effective when people have experienced an accumulation of adversity during development. So as I start this next section, I just want to remind us that even though it's very common in the literature to hear the words trauma and trauma-informed care, that sort of thing, as a part of how we approach building resilience, and that is very important. But the ACE study suggests and demonstrates through its findings that it's not just overwhelming stress or trauma that creates adaptations during development. It's also chronic adversity and neglect. So even lower levels of chronic stress have a profound impact on health. And Dr. Rob Anda, co-principal investigator of the ACE study, wrote in his 2009 report about the Washington data, he said for an epidemic of influenza or a hurricane, an earthquake or a tornado, the worst is really quickly over and we can begin treatment and recovery. So there's a clear point at which the trauma ends and we begin recovery and treatment. But when we think about ACEs, there's a chronic disaster that results that's insidious, and it's constantly rolling out in people's lives and from generation to generation. And that is more difficult to work with, and the resilience literature isn't as well adapted yet, it isn't as well developed yet to work on this issue of chronic, insidious rolling out of stress generation to generation. And that's another reason that we really wanted to look at resilience questions from the standpoint of what about the factors that help people who have very high ACE scores? What can we learn from their responses to the phone surveys that will help us support them better? In Washington, our basic theory is that parenting adults have the most power for preventing ACEs. They can prevent ACEs from one generation to the next. But parenting can feel a lot harder for people who have very high ACEs because they're more likely to have more ACE-attributable problems. Parenting can be harder because it is harder biologically for people with higher ACE scores. And the reason I say that is that ACEs lead to many different kinds of health and social problems throughout the life course. So there are many ACEs related to many kinds of problems. This is a fairly comprehensive list of what we found from the Washington data. So ACEs are leading to risk for disease. They're leading to their ACEs are driving the rates of the leading causes of death in the U.S. ACEs are driving the rates of many mental health challenges, many health and social problems, and ACEs also drive the transmission of ACEs into the next generation. The second reason that ACEs are so powerful and we should really think about how they impact people's ability to parent is that ACEs are driving such a large percentage of many of those kinds of ACE-attributable problems. So this is a visual that we created in Washington. The center of this represents an oil slick, because we first created this kind of visual after the Gulf oil spill. And the center of this really represents the percentage of each of these conditions that is attributable to or caused by adverse childhood experience. And this particular diagram really shows a variety of health and social kinds of behavioral problems. And you can see that between 22 and what's the highest one here, 65% of these conditions are driven by or attributable to adverse childhood experience. And then in terms of behavioral health, here we see the same kind of image that shows that a very, very large percentage of behavioral health challenges are attributable to adverse childhood experience. So if parents are facing health problems and behavioral health problems, parenting can be much more difficult. And so we need to make sure we're thinking of resilience in the context of these very real challenges in the lives of people with adverse childhood experience in their history. So we're the ones that can make the accommodations that help parents have more ease in their parenting through the kinds of accommodations and supports that we build for parents. And we believe that one of the most powerful strategies is to work with parents with very high ACE scores to moderate the effects of ACEs in ways that help them protect their children from having high ACE scores. So in this data that I'm going to show you, we very intentionally asked questions about, are these resilience factors improving parents' lives in ways that would make it more likely that they could prevent high ACE scores for their children? And the reason that's so important is that as we're effective in reducing ACE effects among parents, they can prevent high ACE scores for their children. And by the way, we don't have to get to 0 to make a huge impact in health and social well-being in the next generation. Even if we reduce ACE scores a small amount from one generation to the next, we get very, very significant, let me show you, very, very significant reductions, because it's like putting a sponge in the middle of this oil slick. We reduce all of these conditions in the population concurrently. Since one disease agent, ACEs, is leading to all of these problems, when we reduce the disease agent, we reduce all of the problems at once. So we can reduce ACE effects, that leads to less ACE scores, and as those children grow up, they will then in turn have less ACE effects, which will allow them to prevent ACEs in their children's generation. So over the generations, we can get this profound improvement in mental, physical, behavioral health, as well as workforce and social problems. As we look at the resilience literature more generally, researchers tell us that we need to improve 3 spheres of life in order to have more resilience in the population as a whole. So one is capabilities. The second sphere we need to improve is attachment and belonging. And the third is community and culture and spirituality, that sphere of life that is larger than self. And most of our investments tend to be in capabilities, and that can be challenging because capabilities are the very things that are affected by ACEs in people's lives. So if we invest all of our time, energy, and money in building capabilities, we may not get the largest size of improvement, whereas if we also invest in attachment, belonging, and community, culture, and spirituality, we're more likely to get bigger impacts in terms of building flourishing in the population as a whole. So Dr. Martin Luther King, when he was doing his speech in 1964, right before he won the Nobel Prize, or received the Nobel Prize, he said that there's nothing more dangerous than to build a society with a segment of society with no stake in society. And he was talking about race, but I would suggest that this is also something we could think about in terms of ACE, in terms of adverse childhood experience, because our society's regular responses to people who have adapted to toxic stress during development, our normal response, unfortunately, is to reject people, to isolate them, to make changes in policy and behaviors that result in them not being able to contribute their core gifts to society. So we get a second benefit when we think carefully about supporting parents. We get the benefit that they can contribute not only to their children, but also to the whole of their community. So as we've added these questions to our behavioral health risk factor surveillance system, we've also had an eye toward how do we create the kind of information that will help every community support the population most affected by ACEs become the biggest agents of change, to have the kind of ease in their life where they can make a big difference for their community as a whole. So we started collecting data about resilience factors that we found in the literature that could support that whole theory of change. And then we did a factor analysis based on the data that was coming back in from adults in Washington, and found 4 separate factors that make a big difference in health and well-being among adults, even those with high ACE scores. So the first is support. People who feel socially, emotionally supported and hopeful, and we had 2 different questions in the Burfess we were using, both well supported in the literature. And this first factor is about how I feel about my own life. Do I feel socially and emotionally supported? Can I imagine a better future? Can I imagine that there's a path to that better future and I could be on that path? So hopeful has those 3 portions to it, so that's the first factor we look at. The second factor is having 2 or more people who will show up in our lives and give us help when we need it. And I don't mean on Facebook. I mean actually they'll physically show up at our homes or our work or wherever we are and give us help if we need it. The third is something we've named community reciprocity, and it has to do with the interaction among people in a neighborhood or social group. And we look at a cluster of 3 questions to learn about this. Do people regularly watch out for children? Can you count on adults to intervene if children are in trouble or are skipping school? And do people normally, is it normal for people to do favors for one another? So all those questions are about the interaction among adults and children and among adults. And then the fourth factor is called social bridging. And social bridging is the hardest kind of social capital to build, but it's very powerful. And we find this in the literature on social capital, but also in the literature from anthropology. And social bridging is about, well, I'll just tell you the question we asked in Burfus was, imagine the circle of people that you rely on for help and support in your life. How common is it for anyone from that circle to reach outside the circle to someone you don't know well to bring help inside for some person inside of the circle? Social bridging is so important because it allows for a group of people, maybe it's a group of people with very high ACE scores, who at any given moment may not have the resources, the energy, the time, the health to help one another, even though they do care for one another. And so if it's a norm in the community to reach outside the circle and bring help in, or to reach outside the circle to give help, we weave a strength across the social fabric, across the social silos that exist within a community, and make the community as a whole stronger. So all of these four factors come from the literature, and it's from literature in particular that talks about the link between resilience and multi-generational well-being in the face of difficulty. So let me show you something about social emotional support and hope. And each of these slides is set up in the same way. So across the bottom, the horizontal axis, we see the ACE scores from 0, 1 to 3, and 4 to 8. And then the vertical axis is the percentage of the population with the topic that's at the title of the screen. So in this case, it's the percentage of the population with activity limitations. And you can see just what we would expect. These are people that reported low levels of support and hope. And we see this dose-response relationship. The higher the ACE score, the higher the percentage of the population that have activity limitations in their lives. But what happens when we ask people who have high support and hope, what happens to that percentage of the population? You see this big statistically significant drop in the percentage of people who experience activity limitations if they have social support and hope. So let's look at smoking. You see again the dose-response relationship between ACEs and smoking, and then if we look at people with high support and hope, this big statistically significant drop in the percentage who are smoking. That kind of makes sense because many people choose nicotine because it's so effective with attention, anxiety, depression, emotional regulation, and the social kinds of environments in which people are smoking together help people who have relationship challenges. So social support can also result in people feeling less anxiety, more ease in terms of relationships, and help with depression. So we shouldn't be surprised to see these impacts in the data. But what about sleep? Not getting enough sleep 7 or more days in the last month, an indicator of mental health, and we see again big statistically significant drops when we have social emotional support. This is people with poor mental health more than half of the last month. We see this dose-response relationship. See doubling of the risk between those with 0 ACEs and those with very high ACE scores for having poor mental health more than half of the last month. And this is this dramatic reduction in the number of people who report poor mental health when they have social emotional support. This is poor physical health, and we see the same pattern. I might note that even among the people with high social support and hope, we still see a dose-response relationship, right, between the higher the ACE scores, the higher the percentage of people with poor physical health. The difference is it's much less people that have poor physical health. So as I show you this next set, which is about workplace, I just wanted to also mention that work can be more difficult for people with high ACE scores. And this is another one of these oil slick slides that shows us the relationship between ACEs, the center oil slick portion, and all of the leading kinds of reasons that people have challenges in the workplace. So for example, 25% of workplace injury is attributable to ACEs. 28% of not having satisfaction with work. 1 in 5 of people that are out of work more than a year attributable to ACEs. 43% of people who have interrupted work because of ill health, and you can read all the way around. So work can be more difficult for people with high ACE scores. And as we would expect from that, we see this dose-response relationship between ACEs and people reporting, I'm unable to work. So the higher the ACE score, the larger the percentage of the population reporting they're not able to work. But with social emotional support and hope, we see a much larger percentage of the population reporting that they feel able to work. So we think social emotional support and hope have high potential to build in terms of building resilience among parenting adults and teens who will be the next parenting generation, in terms of helping them with all aspects of their life, their physical health, their mental health, their sleep, and their ability to work. All of those get improved when we see these. So I want to talk now about this notion of having 2 or more people who help. And this comes from 2 different studies. One is from the LongScan study, which is a child welfare study conducted in many states. It is a longitudinal study. Washington was one of the states. And this article by Desmond Runyon is about the social capital, the environments that children and their parents are living in. And Desmond Runyon and his colleagues found that having the number of people that mom can count on for help and support is directly related to the child well-being scores in a family that's engaged with child welfare services. So they found that for every additional person mom can count on for practical help, things like somebody could take her to the grocery store, somebody could watch her kids for an hour, somebody could take a walk with her and process what was happening with her day, those kinds, give her a ride to the doctor, those concrete or practical kinds of help. For every additional person mom could count on, it had the equivalent in child well-being scores as if mom were earning another $15,000 of income. So while we would love for moms to earn more income, that's certainly critical and vital, especially in this big downturn in the economy. We might not always be able to create that in people's lives. But we certainly can, as a community, increase the number of people that mom can count on for support. And this literature would suggest that as we do that, child well-being scores should be improved.
Say, Laura, this is Becky.
Yep.
There's a question that's come in.
Yeah.
Hope Martinez is asking, for current information, how is support and hope rated? Did the participants in the study rate their support and hope?
They rated social emotional support was on a Likert scale. So the question was, how often do you receive the social emotional support you need in your life? And these were people that said very often or always, as opposed to never, rarely, infrequently. So it was on a Likert scale. Hope, we are planning on measuring hope in a better way in the future, but in this case it was a reverse index from a question about hopelessness, the extent to which one feels hopeless in their lives. It was a question about how often do you feel hopeless, and again this is a reverse index, so we took the people who said never or rarely. Any other question, Hope, related to that? I mean, related to those?
I don't see any coming in, and
okay. And I just want to note that we've petitioned our BRFIS managers. BRFIS is the nickname for the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System. We've petitioned our BRFIS managers to add a 6-question hope scale in next year's BRFIS. So you should ask me a couple years from now. We should have even more information about hope. What I like about the 6-question scale, which was developed by Dr. Taylor, I believe, is that it has 3 questions that are about my feeling of hope, my feeling that there could be a better future in my life, and 3 questions that are about the degree to which I feel like I could achieve that better future. And I think those 2 elements, if we're able to peel those apart, might give us even more powerful clues about how to help people with high ACE scores. But we won't have that if we're successful in getting those questions into the 2016 BRFAS. We won't even have that data till 2017, so there's some delay in the system, unfortunately. So the second place where we found this information about having 2 or more people who will help you in your life is from the Strengthening Families Framework, which is from the Center for the Study of Social Policy. And the Strengthening Families Framework has 5 different factors that they found are highly correlated with families and children having better well-being and better safety in terms of child maltreatment. And one of those factors is having people you can count on for concrete help when you need that help. The question that we used in this particular version of the BRFAS was to ask how many people can you count on for practical support when you need it. If people were confused about what practical support meant, we had several prompts that said, you know, a ride to the store or doctor, somebody who might watch your children for an hour while you did something you needed to do, etc. So that was the question we used. And the data itself told us that we might use a cut line of 2 or more people. There were significant gains when folks said they had 2 or more, and then those gains dropped off a little bit, although more people was good, more people is better, but 2 or more, there's kind of a threshold that the data showed us where people who have 2 or more are more likely to have these benefits I'm going to show you. So this first one is my family is hungry because I don't have enough money to buy food. And I wasn't too surprised to see a big impact, because I was thinking, well, if I'm hungry, I don't have enough money for food, but I have 2 or more people that would show up and help me, they might bring me food. That would make sense. Or like when I was a new mom, my family was pretty poor at that time, and my circle of friends, we would share. Somebody would have beans, somebody else would have some cumin, somebody else might have an onion. We could sort of figure out how to make sure we all had enough. So that social practical help can be makes sense, I think, to most of us why we would see this big improvement in whether we're hungry because we don't have enough money for food. But I was surprised to see this link to diabetes, where we see this dose-response relationship between ACEs and insulin-dependent diabetes, and a big drop in the percentage of population with insulin-dependent diabetes if they have practical help in their lives. This is ACEs and people who report they're depressed all or most of the last month, and with help we see these big statistically significant drops in this. And I want to just stop for a moment, because remember my theory of change was that if we can find resilience factors that are really help to moderate the effects of ACEs on parenting adults in ways that they can protect their children, that probably gives us the best odds for reducing ACE scores in the next generation. And depression is such a powerful factor in whether parents are able to protect children from higher ACEs. And depression is common among moms and dads who have high ACE scores, and it gets in the way of people being able to go through all of the different steps that it takes to manage a household and to manage it in a way that's really protective of ACE scores for the next generation. So when I see this slide, I'm really hopeful that we're on the right track in terms of which resilience factors to build that can really help to reduce those ACE scores from one generation to the next. And this set of slides is about the symptoms of moderate to serious mental illness. So in the behavioral risk factor surveillance system, we added the Kessler 6. It's a set of 6 questions developed by Dr. Kessler that is the best surveillance tool to use as an indicator of the degree to which people are struggling with mental illness symptoms. And we used Kessler scores that indicated that people were struggling with moderate to severe mental illness symptoms. That would be serious or significant depression, debilitating depression, all the way through people struggling with hallucinations and those kinds of very significant mental illness symptoms. So we see here the dose-response relationship between ACEs and mental illness symptoms, and this tremendous drop in people reporting that they're struggling with those symptoms. And again, this seems to me so critical as we think about parenting adults, because these people might still, probably still, might have mental illness diagnoses, but they could have a diagnosis of a mental illness, but be effectively supported and medicated such that they're not struggling with the symptoms of those serious and persistent mental illnesses, which is going to make it much easier for them to prevent ACEs in the next generation. This is ACEs in poor physical health. We see these big improvements. And in terms of community engagement, we wanted to look at this issue of how are people doing in terms of their ability to fully participate in community life. I just wanted to show you this third example of an oil slick slide that shows you these significant percentages of these barriers to community engagement. And some of the biggest ones that are new that you might not have seen before in other presentations, if you're familiar with ACE presentations, are the calculation on adults reporting that they've been incarcerated while they were adults. So this is among people who are not currently incarcerated. They were able to take a phone call from the Vervis survey, so they were not in a prison or a jail. But they're reporting that while they've been an adult, they've been incarcerated in a prison or a jail. 61% of reporting a history of adult incarceration is attributable to ACEs. 62% of reporting having been homeless as an adult is attributable to ACEs. So you can see all around this oil slick these significant impacts to community engagement. So those impacts lead us to understanding how powerful community can be and how important it is for us to look at the context of people's lives in terms of the milieu or the interaction, the social interactions in a community, and how able is the community to provide those just right fit between the kind of supports and accommodations we give so that people can engage in community life and can participate in ways that help them to give their core gifts. And I would suggest we can't expect all the change to come from those individuals. We need to change our communities to make the community more accessible to those people and more welcoming to those people. So we started adding community-level resilience questions to our BRFIS in 2011, 12, and 14. And those community resilience questions have to do with community reciprocity. Again, that's how people are interacting as indicated by watching out for children, intervening, and doing favors for one another. And then this social capital, social bridging indicator. And we don't have as many charts and graphs yet. We're still working with methodologists. It's a little tricky to work with community-level resilience, a lot easier methodologically to work with individual resilience indicators. So now I'm understanding more about why we see so much in the resilience literature about individuals, because it's easier to do the analysis. But what I can tell you, and we will have more analysis. It is possible to do that. We're working those things out. We'll have more. So invite me back and I'll share more in another year or so. But right now what we can see is that in communities that score high in terms of reciprocity and social bridging, we see better rates in the population, including the population with high ACE scores, of obesity, of mental illness symptoms using the Kessler scale. We see better rates, lower rates of women reporting high alcohol consumption, and these are parenting age women. better rates of physical activity, better reports of happiness. We see that populations saying they're less worried about money for rent. They're more likely to have a primary care provider. They're less likely to experience housing instability, and they're less likely to report being hungry because they don't have money. So this interaction of adults and the norm of reaching outside a social circle are associated with both better health status, things like obesity, and I think we would also see and mental illness symptoms. I think it's also diabetes, and there are other health status kinds of indicators that we'll be adding as we do more analysis. But what's important about this particular list to me is it's also associated with better health behavior. Things like alcohol consumption, physical activity, having a primary care provider. So those are important because when we have better health status and better health behavior, we get that double benefit of improving our functionality in lives and that continuous improvement in health status because our behaviors are less likely to bring us into less healthy conditions. You can hear my cat Mars is now meowing to all of you. So I'm going to just wrap up and then hear what kind of questions or discussion we might have by just reminding us about taking a trauma-informed approach as we're building more resilience. Because the resilience literature isn't as well developed yet to tell us everything we might want to know about the particular kinds of actions we would take to build resilience among people who have had lots of adverse childhood experience and development. We're still seeing brand new information come into our awareness and coming into the literature, like the information I just shared with you from the Washington Burfess. So we need to really be thinking about a trauma-informed approach to learning together, to gathering the data, and that has to do with realizing the prevalence of ACEs in the population and recognizing specifically how it affects people so that we're looking at resilience factors that particularly address those kinds of things that ACEs are likely to have affected in the population. We need to resist re-traumatization. That might seem obvious, but many of the ways we build community or we build systems actually can have an unintended consequences of leaving people with high ACEs out of the benefits that we're building. So we need to intentionally look to see whether people with high ACE scores are receiving benefits and whether what we're doing is actually going to help them fully participate in community life and in the betterment of their own families. And then we need to respond by putting all of this knowledge into practice. So for example, we might learn that having 2 or more people that can help can have a powerful impact. So then how do we think about our relationship-based services to help those services add increasing the social network and helping people to develop the skills and knowledge abilities so that they can increase the number of people who will show up and help. That could be something we could add to all of our services and to our neighborhood organizing. So we need to respond by thinking practically about how we adapt our current practices to put these new facts into those practices. And then just a quick reminder of trauma-informed system principles of safety, trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, and empowerment. I don't want to talk too much about these, but just to remind you of them and also to remind you that ACEs include both trauma, which is the overwhelming or flooding kinds of experiences that cause that danger, fight, flight, freeze response, but also chronic adversity and neglect. And so we're still learning more about what the core principles of a neglect-informed system might look like, and we should be learning together everything we possibly can about whether we might need to add some principles to this list that are particularly relevant to that population because they also have had development affected by adversity. So with that, I just want to give you my email so you can reach to me and then spend a few minutes seeing what kind of questions or comments or what would you like to add, because I know everybody that's on the webinar probably has your own things that you're learning about what kinds of factors really make a big difference, and I would just love to hear what you're learning as well.
So we have one question ready while other people are hopefully typing theirs in and or raising their hands. We'd love to hear your voices if that can work. So Roxy Foster asks, is there an interest in other states to continue the well-being questions in their BRFIS?
That's a great question. I don't know of other states that are intentionally or systematically adding these kinds of well-being or resilience questions. But I'm talking more across the nation about what we're seeing, and so we may see people pick them up. And then here's some good news. We have a major national foundation that is very excited about what's emerging from this kind of questions, and they have funded my office at the Foundation for Healthy Generations to do a feasibility study to just think through if we had the constellation of questions we would really love that would give us a better sense of sort of resilience across the life course and the relationship between adversity, childhood, adult adversity, and resilience across the life course, what would those questions be? What would that surveillance instrument look like? So we are trying to figure that out right now. We're inventing it as we go based on literature and based on feedback we hear from people like you. By the end of the year, we hope to have a preliminary report, and then we'll go into a year-long period where engaging stakeholders and fine-tuning, and hopefully we will then be able to either add a second survey instrument to the BRFIS in a state, or do callback. You can call back everyone that received a BRFIS telephone call and ask them a second set of questions. So we're trying to design toward a future where we'll have a more comprehensive view, and then we hope the CDC and other states will pick that up and begin to, at least once every decade, really look closely at life course resilience factors.
Thank you. So I'm still waiting for others to raise their hand or type a question. While I'm waiting, I will ask one. And that is, I wonder, so you talked about support, and I don't see the slide in front of me, and support and hope and bridging and...
Let me go back to that list.
What I'm wondering is if you might give us an example or two from each of those about what community, I know your work, there's so much that's happened in Washington State, and you're really in touch with what's happening nationally, of how communities have done things to increase those. Since now we have data that show that when these things are there, we mitigate the outcomes of adverse childhood experiences. So what are some things communities have done that have increased these in your experience?
Great question.
Or whatever.
Yeah. Okay, so social emotional support is something we internally feel, and so it's a little tricky to develop a better understanding of social emotional support. What we've seen there is an example of that, and hope, is changes to home visitor programs where home visitors are intentionally having conversation about ACE history and then talking about how that home visiting client experiences social emotional support, because we all experience social emotional support and hope differently, and so helping the person to think through what is it that other people do that causes me to experience feeling supported, and then they help that home visit customer to be able to verbalize or articulate to other people, I don't feel as supported when you call me every day. I feel more supportive that when I reach out, you respond to me in a particular way. Or I feel more socially, emotionally supported when you talk to me without all those hand gestures. That makes me feel afraid, and I don't feel very emotionally supported when you do that. So each person has a different way of experiencing reality moment by moment. Yeah. And so it's important that we understand and have a conversation about what makes you feel socially, emotionally supported. And then the literature on hope says that hope-filled action, so action toward that better future, is important. So we've seen whole neighborhoods host like family cafe dialogues, and help the community to generate through those dialogues a sense of what kind of action would take us closer to the future we want for our neighborhood, and then to have small amounts of resource to support those parents in actually taking that action. So those are two examples of building social emotional support and hope.
And the cafes are ones we've done quite a bit of here in Minnesota
Yeah,
too. So that's, yeah.
right, right. And I think you could probably do cafe dialogue. It would be interesting to kind of surface from a group about, are there some patterns of what makes people feel socially, emotionally supported? I mean, it surfaces the awareness that just because I'm doing something that would help me feel it doesn't mean that other person feels it because I did it, right?
Right, and it's so easy to just sort of naturally try to give someone what you think you would need in that moment, which may be very different from what they would need. So that's really helpful.
Totally, yeah, totally. And the feeling of social emotional support can be affected by adversity, and so it's probably even more amenable to individual differences than some of these other factors. So it's kind of a cool one to work with because you can end up with this sort of library of options that can make you more effective in your relationships and in your work.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, 2 or more people who will help. We have seen cafe dialogues really effective with this in neighborhood organizing. And then we're seeing public health departments, child welfare. I think you have alternative response kinds of systems in place in Minnesota like we do in Washington. And so those alternative response, instead of children being removed from the home, instead there's much more of a wraparound approach to providing the kinds of help and support so that family can stay together. And those wraparound systems are now incorporating this notion of building a stronger social network and also providing training and support to the people who will help a family so that those helpers are more in tune to the stressors. Because people who experience a lot of toxic stress during childhood, it can be a very small amount of stress that can feel like a gigantic crisis to them. They experience small stressors as big crises. And so it's really helpful to build a network of people around a family where people agree to show up and help, even if it seems like a small thing that the parent is asking. The parent may say, I just got a phone call and I have to get ready for a doctor appointment. I got to have help. And the person receiving the call is thinking, that's not a reason you need help. You just get ready for a doctor appointment. But to the person, that might feel like a giant crisis. It's an interruption in their regular routine. It's a small stressor that they could be experiencing as a major stressor. And so preparing the helpers to show up, even if the call seems small, that's a really important preparation you can put in place. And we're seeing both neighborhoods and service providers make those changes, both in understanding that I need more people I could call on so I don't burn people out, and also preparing the helpers to be responsive even when there are small things.
I have an anecdotal experience recently. A friend of mine who is parenting a child with very severe disability challenges, and they have periodic. She was talking about how when there's a major incident, everybody comes around and is there to help, but the sort of chronic day-to-day ongoing support is not there as much, and how much that when the issues you're dealing with are chronic, how much having people there, even in what it's a little bit different from what you're talking about in terms of the small things seeming big, but there's also just the small things ongoing, and that small things really matter.
Wearing you down, right. So you don't have a lot more reserve, and you need more people. And I would say really a different circumstance than your friend. But I have a relative with a serious and persistent mental illness, and one of the things that I do when I travel a lot, I work in all sorts of states, and so when I travel, I actually have a pretty long list of people that I can call in to go help her, because my family member, she can burn people out pretty quick. No, she has to have more than 2 people in order that any given time 2 people might show up and help. Does that make sense? So if people have been more affected or have more difficult lives, they might need a larger social circle, not a smaller one. But the natural ways our communities are organized, the very people that most need the most folks have the least folks.
Yeah.
So we have to intentionally build those.
Right.
Well,
and now you're sort of talking about, you're giving an individual example of how you are doing social bridging. Right?
Yeah,
so
right.
you're looking outside of your circle to bring in more people to be a larger support circle.
That's absolutely right. Yeah.
So I want to make sure that I could have a conversation with you for hours, and and there is one other question that's come in that I want to make sure to ask, and also encourage people. We are wrapping up in about 5 minutes, that if you have a question, please do type it in. But the additional question Roxy again asks, and I like this in terms of really how you talk about adults who are currently parenting being, a having a key role. And she asks if anyone has created a presentation on ACEs specifically focused for parents and families.
I think quite a few people have. The one that I'm most familiar with is the Walla Walla community. So you might know Walla Walla, Washington, has been doing ACE and resilience education for, since 2003, so a long time.
Wow.
And they've built a very high level of general awareness about adverse childhood experience and resilience. And in the most recent years, actually, they have a community coordinator position. It used to be funded by the state, and now pooled money is supporting that position because it's been found to be so valuable. And Walla Walla has made big changes to many of their systems. And about 6 years ago, I would estimate, Terry Barilla, their community coordinator, she got really impatient about the idea that as a society, we spend so much money on intervention and not much money making sure that we're preventing ACEs in the next generation, and not much money making sure that we're building resilience among parents. And so Terry started the Children's Resilience Initiative in Walla Walla. You can Google it, or you can Google Resilience Trumps ACEs, and you'll see these amazing materials that they've made. And they have developed very specific decks of slides that are about teaching parents about ACEs and about the kinds of resilience factors that can help to build resilience in families and children. And then they've also developed materials like this fabulous deck of cards that has 10 ACE cards and 42 resilience cards, and it has card games that families can play. And what they found is the family members in the Children's Resilience Initiative, the family members said, we don't know what this word resilience even means. We don't know what you're talking about. We don't relate to it. All you professionals keep using these words we don't understand. And so that's what led them to build 42 resilience cards, because it builds a common language around the kinds of factors that make a difference, like these you see here. And then they even have like a resilience treasure hunt, where they have whole family fun events where families can come, and there's free pizza, and there's, it's a fun environment, and they have a treasure hunt, and families move from place to place hunting for the treasure and the clues. And when they get to the next treasure, it's a resilience card, and you can't get the next clue until you have a little skit or theater to play out what that resilience would look like in your family. So the children and the parents together have this little skit. And they go from place to place, and then everyone wins prizes. So those kinds of materials have been built by that community. They're fabulous. They're great graphics and really well thought through. And families have participated in making those materials. So you can be pretty confident that they'll resonate with folks. So that's either at the Children's Resilience Initiative, Walla Walla, that same website. You can, if you Google Resilience Trumps ACEs, you'll get to that same website.
Great. We'll send that out to everybody with the follow-up email so they have it.
Yeah, and there's a whole parent pathway that you can walk through the steps they've taken and what they have available for parents.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Well, I also want to mention before people start signing off that we will be sending a follow-up email with an evaluation. So please give us feedback. We will share it with Laura, but it also helps us in terms of designing future webinars. So we'd really hope that you could give us that. And I don't see any additional questions. Laura, is there anything you would like to say as the last word?
that if any of you have ideas about the kinds of questions that should be added, that we should be asking, you know, please let Becky know, because we are working now to try to develop a more complete look at the kinds of factors that would make a difference for this generational improvement we're trying to seek. And really, in some ways, you know, we are looking at literature, but in some ways we're totally relying on your wisdom and the wisdom of people doing this work in the field to build a better surveillance instrument. We really need your input and your ideas. So even if you don't have a question, if you just have a topic we think we should look into, we really welcome that input right now, because we're building that now over the next 6 months.
So Laura, if you wouldn't mind switching the slides so that it's at your email address at the end, so in case people want to get that jotted down.
Okay, well, let's go through all of them.
There, we'll refresh those brain pathways away.
Here we go, almost there.
There we go. Alrighty. Well, thank you so very much for talking with us today. Really was wonderful.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, we'll definitely talk about doing more of these. We will invite you back for sure.
Okay, great. Thanks all of you.
All right, thanks everyone. Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye-bye.